when they are delivered at scale, it's going to have an impact on the world at a scale that no one understands yet.
Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, just did an interview at Stanford where he talked about a lot of controversial stuff. Initially, the interview was uploaded on Stanford's YouTube channel, but a couple days later, the interview was taken down from YouTube and everywhere else. But today, I was somehow able to access the interview video after spending multiple hours. So let's watch it together and dissect some important parts of the interview.
In the next year, you're going to see very large context windows, agents, and text to action. When they are delivered at scale, it's going to have an impact on the world at a scale that no one understands yet. Much bigger than the horrific impact we've had by social media, right, in my view. So here's why. In a context window, you can basically use that as short-term memory. And I was shocked that context windows get this long. The technical reasons have to do with the fact that it's hard to serve, hard to calculate, and so forth. The interesting thing about short-term memory is that when you feed you ask it a question, read 20 books, you give it the text of the books is the query, and you say, tell me what they say. It forgets the middle, which is exactly how human brains work too, right? That's where we are. With respect to agents, there are people who are now building essentially LLM agents, and the way they do it is they read something like chemistry, they discover the principles of chemistry, and then they test it. And then they add that back into their understanding, right? That's extremely powerful. And then the third thing, as I mentioned, is text to action. So I'll give you an example. The government is in the process of trying to ban TikTok. We'll see if that actually happens. If TikTok is banned, here's what I propose each and every one of you do. Say to your LLM the following. Make me a copy of TikTok, steal all the users, steal all the music, put my preferences in it, produce this program in the next 30 seconds, release it, and in 1 hour, if it's not viral, do something different along the same lines. That's the command. Boom, 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 right? You understand how powerful that is. If you can go from arbitrary language to arbitrary digital command, which is essentially what Python in this scenario is, imagine that each and every human on the planet has their own programmer that actually does what they want, as opposed to the programmers that work for me who don't do what I ask, right? The programmers here know what I'm talking about. So imagine a non-arrogant programmer that actually does what you want, and you don't have to pay all that money to. And there's infinite supply of these programs.
And this is all within the next year or two.
Very soon.
So we've already discussed on this channel a number of different versions of this, whether you're talking about Aider, Devon, Pythagora, or just using agents to collaborate with each other in code. There are just so many great options for coding assistants right now. However, AI coders that can actually build full-stack complex applications are not quite there yet, but hopefully soon. Also, what he's describing, just saying download all the music and the secrets and recreate, that's not really possible right now. Obviously, all of that stuff is behind security walls, and you can't just download all that stuff. So if he's saying, hey, replicate the functionality, you can certainly do that.
Those three things, and I'm quite convinced it's the union of those three things that will happen in the next wave. So you asked about what else is going to happen. Every 6 months I oscillate. So we're on it's an even odd oscillation. So at the moment, the gap between the frontier models, of which there are now only 3, I'll review who they are, and everybody else, appears to me to be getting larger. 6 months ago, I was convinced that the gap was getting smaller. So I invested lots of money in the little companies. Now I'm not so sure. And I'm talking to the big companies, and the big companies are telling me that they need 10 billion, 20 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion.
Stargate is 100 billion, right?
They're very, very hard. Sam Altman is a close friend. He believes that it's going to take about 300 billion, maybe more. I pointed out to him that I'd done the calculation on the amount of energy required, and I then, in the spirit of full disclosure, went to the White House on Friday and told them that we need to become best friends with Canada, because Canada has really nice people, helped invent AI and lots of hydropower. Because we as a country do not have enough power to do this. The alternative is to have the Arabs fund it. And I like the Arabs personally. I spent lots of time there, right? But they're not going to adhere to our national security rules, whereas Canada and the US are part of a triumvirate where we all agree on.
So these $100 billion, $300 billion data centers, electricity starts becoming the scarce resource.
Now, first of all, we definitely don't have enough energy resources to achieve AGI. It's just not possible right now. And Eric is also assuming that we're going to need more and more data and larger models to reach AGI, which I think is also actually true. Sam Altman has said similar things. He has said that we need to be able to do more with less, or even the same amount of data, because we've already used all the data that humanity has ever created. There's really no more left. So we're going to need to either figure out how to create synthetic data that is valuable, not just derivative, and we're also going to have to do more with the data that we do have.
You were at Google for a long time, and they invented the transformer architecture.
Peter. It's all Peter's fault.
Thanks to brilliant people over there like Peter and Jeff Dean and everyone. But now it doesn't seem like they've kind of lost the initiative to OpenAI, and even the last leaderboard I saw, Anthropic's Claude was at the top of the list. I asked Sundar this. He didn't really give me a very sharp answer. Maybe you have a sharper or a more objective explanation for what's going on there.
I'm no longer a Google employee.
Yes.
In the spirit of full disclosure, Google decided that work-life balance and going home early and working from home was more important than winning.
Okay, so that is the line that got him in trouble. It was everywhere, all over Twitter, all over the news, when he said Google prioritized work-life balance, going home early, and not working as hard as the competitor. They chose work-life balance over winning, and that's actually a pretty common perception of Google.
And the reason startups work is because the people work like hell. And I'm sorry to be so blunt, but the fact of the matter is if you all leave the university and go found a company, you're not going to let people work from home and only come in one day a week if you want to compete against the other startups.
When in the early days of Google, Microsoft was like that.
Exactly.
But now it seems to be...
And there's a long history of, in my industry, our industry, I guess, of companies winning in a genuinely creative way and really dominating a space and not making the next transition. It's very well documented. And I think that the truth is founders are special. The founders need to be in charge. The founders are difficult to work with. They push people hard. As much as we can dislike Elon's personal behavior, look at what he gets out of people. I had dinner with him, and he was flying. I was in Montana. He was flying that night at 10 p.m. to have a meeting at midnight with X.AI. Right? Think about it. I was in Taiwan, different country, different culture, and they said that, and this is TSMC, who I'm very impressed with, and they have a rule that the starting PhDs coming out of they're good physicists work in the factory on the basement floor. Now, can you imagine getting American physicists to do that? The PhDs? Highly unlikely. Different work ethic. And the problem here, the reason I'm being so harsh about work is that these are systems which have network effects. So time matters a lot. And in most businesses, time doesn't matter that much. Right? You have lots of time. You know, Coke and Pepsi will still be around, and the fight between Coke and Pepsi will continue to go along, and it's all glacial, right? When I dealt with telcos, the typical telco deal would take 18 months to sign, right? There's no reason to take 18 months to do anything. Get it done. It's just, we're in a period of maximum growth, maximum gain.
So here he was asked about competition with China's AI and AGI. And that's his answer. We're ahead. We need to stay ahead. And we need money.
Yeah, it's going to play a role or competition with China as well.
So I was the chairman of an AI commission that sort of looked at this very carefully. And you can read it. It's about 752 pages. And I'll just summarize it by saying, we're ahead. We need to stay ahead. And we need lots of money to do so. our customers were the Senate and the House. And out of that came the CHIPS Act and a lot of other stuff like that. A rough scenario is that if you assume the frontier models drive forward and a few of the open source models, it's likely that a very small number of countries can play this game. What are those countries, or who are they? Countries with a lot of money and a lot of talent, strong educational systems, and a willingness to win. The US is one of them. China's another one. How many others are there?
Are there any others?
I don't know, maybe. But certainly in your lifetimes, the battle between the US and China for knowledge supremacy is going to be the big fight, right? So the US government banned essentially the NVIDIA chips, although they weren't allowed to say that was what they were doing, but they actually did that into China. They have about a 10-year chip advantage. We have a roughly 10-year chip advantage in terms of sub-DUV, that is sub-5 nanometer
10 years, that long?
Roughly 10 years.
Wow.
And so you're going to have, so an example would be, today we're a couple of years ahead of China. My guess is we'll get a few more years ahead of China, and the Chinese are whopping mad about this. It's like hugely upset about it.
Well, let's talk about a real war that's going on. I know that something you've been very involved in is the Ukraine war, and in particular, I don't know how much you can talk about White Stork and your goal of having $500 drones destroy $5 million tanks.
So
how's that changing warfare?
So I worked for the Secretary of Defense for 7 years and tried to change the way we run our military. I'm not a particularly big fan of the military, but it's very expensive, and I wanted to see if I could be helpful. And I think, in my view, I largely failed. They gave me a medal, so they must give medals to failure or whatever. But my self-criticism was nothing has really changed. And the system in America is not going to lead to real innovation. So watching the Russians use tanks to destroy apartment buildings with little old ladies and kids just drove me crazy. So I decided to work on a company with your friend Sebastian Thrun, and as a former faculty member here, and a whole bunch of Stanford people. And the idea basically is to do two things: use AI in complicated, powerful ways for these essentially robotic war. And the second one is to lower the cost of the robots. Now you sit there and you go, why would a good liberal like me do that? And the answer is that the whole theory of armies is tanks, artillery, and mortar, and we can eliminate all of them.
So here what he's talking about is that the UK has been able to create really cheap and simple drones by spending just a couple hundred. Ukraine is creating 3D printed drones. They carry a bomb, drop it on $1 million tank, and they've been able to do that over and over again. So there's this asymmetric warfare happening between drones and more traditional artillery.
So there was an article that you and Henry Kissinger and Dan Huttenlocher wrote last year about the nature of knowledge and how it's evolving. I had a discussion the other night about this as well. So for most of history, humans sort of had a mystical understanding of the universe, and then there's the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And in your article, you argue that now these models are becoming so complicated and difficult to understand that we don't really know what's going on in them. I'll take a quote from Richard Feynman. He says, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." I saw this quote the other day. But now people are creating things that they can create, but they don't really understand what's inside of them. Is the nature of knowledge changing in a way? Are we going to have to start just taking the word for these models without them being able to explain it to us?
The analogy I would offer is to teenagers. If you have a teenager, you know they're human, but you can't quite figure out what they're thinking. But somehow we've managed in society to adapt to the presence of teenagers, right? And they eventually grow out of it. And it's serious. So it's probably the case that we're going to have knowledge systems that we cannot fully characterize, but we understand their boundaries, right? We understand the limits of what they can do. And that's probably the best outcome we can get.
Do you think we'll understand the limits?
We'll get pretty good at it.
He's referencing the way that large language models work, which is really essentially a black box. You put in a prompt, you get a response, but we don't know why certain nodes within the algorithm light up, and we don't know exactly how the answers come to be. It is really a black box. There's a lot of work being done right now, trying to kind of unveil what is going on behind the curtain, but we just don't know.
The consensus of my group that meets on every week is that eventually the way you'll do this, it's called so-called adversarial AI, is that there will actually be companies that you will hire and pay money to break your AI system.
Like red team.
So it'll be instead of human red teams, which is what they do today, you'll have whole companies and a whole industry of AI systems whose jobs are to break the existing AI systems and find their vulnerabilities, especially the knowledge that they have that we can't figure out. That makes sense to me. It's also a great project for you here at Stanford, because if you have a graduate student who has to figure out how to attack one of these large models and understand what it does, that is a great skill to build the next generation. So it makes sense to me that the two will travel together.
All right, let's take some questions from the student. There's one right there in the back. Just say your name.
Earlier you mentioned, and this is related to the comment right now, getting AI that actually does what you want. You just mentioned adversarial AI, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that more. So this seems to be, besides, obviously compute will increase and we can get more performant models, but is getting them to do what you want issue seems largely unanswered in my view.
Well, you have to assume that the current hallucination problems become less, right, as the technology gets better and so forth. I'm not suggesting it goes away. And then you also have to assume that there are tests for efficacy. So there has to be a way of knowing that the thing succeeded. So in the example that I gave of the TikTok competitor, and by the way, I was not arguing that you should illegally steal everybody's music. What you would do if you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, which hopefully all of you will be, is if it took off, then you'd hire a whole bunch of lawyers to go clean the mess up, right? But if nobody uses your product, it doesn't matter that you stole all the content. And do not quote me, right? Right?
You're on camera.
Yeah, that's right. But you see my point. In other words, Silicon Valley will run these tests and clean up the mess. And that's typically how those things are done. So my own view is that you'll see more and more performative systems with even better tests and eventually adversarial tests, and that'll keep it within a box. The technical term is called chain of thought reasoning, and people believe that in the next few years you'll be able to generate 1,000 steps of chain of thought reasoning, right? Do this, do this. It's like building recipes, right? That the recipes, you can run the recipe and you can actually test that it produced the correct outcome.
Now, that was maybe not my exact understanding of chain of thought reasoning. My understanding of chain of thought reasoning, which I think is accurate, is when you break a problem down into its basic steps and solve each step, allowing for progression into the next step. Not only does it allow you to replay the steps, it's more about how you break problems down and think through them step by step.
The amounts of money being thrown around are mind-boggling. And I essentially invest in everything because I can't figure out who's going to win. And the amounts of money that are following me are so large. I think some of it is because the early money's been made and the big money people who don't know what they're doing have to have an AI component. And everything is now an AI investment, so they can't tell the difference. I define AI as learning systems that actually learn. So I think that's one of them. The second is that there are very sophisticated new algorithms that are sort of post-transformers. My friend, my collaborator for a long time, has invented a new non-transformer architecture. There's a group that I'm funding in Paris that claims to have done the same thing. So there's enormous invention there, a lot of things at Stanford. And the final thing is that there is a belief in the market that the invention of intelligence has infinite return. So let's say you put $50 billion of capital into a company. You have to make an awful lot of money from intelligence to pay that back. So it's probably the case that we'll go through some huge investment bubble, and then it'll sort itself out. That's always been true in the past, and it's likely to be true here.
Yeah, so there's been something like $1 trillion already invested in artificial intelligence, and only $30 billion in revenue. I think those are accurate numbers, and really, there just hasn't been a return on investment yet. But again, as he just mentioned, that's been the theme in previous waves of technology. huge upfront investment, and then it pays off in the end. Well, I don't know what he's talking about here, because didn't he run Google? And Google has always been about being closed source, and has always tried to protect the algorithm at all costs. So I don't know what he's referring to there.
You think that the leaders are pulling away from the rest?
Right now. And this is a really, the question is roughly the following. There's a company called Mistral in France. They've done a really good job. And I'm obviously an investor. They have produced their second version. Their third model is likely to be closed because it's so expensive. They need revenue and they can't give their model away. So this open source versus closed source debate in our industry is huge. And my entire career was based on people being willing to share software in open source. Everything about me is open source. Much of Google's underpinnings were open source. Everything I've done technically.
What? Didn't he run Google? And Google was all about staying closed source, and everything about Google was kept secret at all times. So I don't know what he's referring to there.
Everything I've done technically. And yet it may be that the capital costs, which are so immense, fundamentally changes how software is built. You and I were talking, my own view of software programmers is that software programmers' productivity will at least double. There are 3 or 4 software companies that are trying to do that. I've invested in all of them in the spirit. And they're all trying to make software programmers more productive. The most interesting one that I just met with is called Augment. And I always think of an individual programmer, and they said, that's not our target. Our target are these 100-person software programming teams on millions of lines of code where nobody knows what's going on. Well, that's a really good AI thing. Will they make money? I hope so. Yes.
So a lot of questions here.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So at the very beginning, you mentioned that there's the combination of the context window expansion, the agents, and the text to action is going to have unimaginable impacts. First of all, why is the combination important? And second of all, I know that you're not like a crystal ball and you can't necessarily tell the future, but why do you think it's beyond anything that we could imagine?
I think largely because the context window allows you to solve the problem of recency. The current models take a year to train, roughly there's 18 months, 6 months of preparation, 6 months of training, 6 months of fine tuning. So they're always out of date. Context window, you can feed what happened. Like you can ask it questions about the Hamas-Israel war, right, in a context. That's very powerful. It becomes current like Google.
Yeah, so that's essentially how Search GPT works. For example, the new search product from OpenAI can scour the web, scrape the web, and then take all of that information and put it into the context window. That is the recency he's talking about.
In the case of agents, I'll give you an example. I set up a foundation, which is funding a nonprofit, which starts, I don't know if there's chemists in the room, I don't really understand chemistry. There's a tool called ChemCrow, C-R-O-W, which was an LLM-based system that learned chemistry. And what they do is they run it to generate chemistry hypotheses about proteins, and they have a lab which runs the tests overnight, and then it learns. That's a huge accelerant in chemistry, material science, and so forth. So that's an agent model. And I think the text to action can be understood by just having a lot of cheap programmers, right? And I don't think we understand what happens, and this is, again, your area of expertise, what happens when everyone has their own programmer. And I'm not talking about turning on and off the lights. I imagine, another example, for some reason you don't like Google. So you say, build me a Google competitor. Yeah, you personally, build me a Google competitor, search the web, build a UI, make a good copy, add generative AI in an interesting way, do it in 30 seconds, and see if it works, right? So a lot of people believe that the incumbents, including Google, are vulnerable to this kind of an attack. Now, we'll see.
How can we stop AI from influencing public opinion, misinformation, especially during the upcoming election? What are the short and long-term solutions from?
Most of the misinformation in this upcoming election and globally will be on social media. And the social media companies are not organized well enough to police it. If you look at TikTok, for example, There are lots of accusations that TikTok is favoring one kind of misinformation over another. And there are many people who claim without proof that I'm aware of that the Chinese are forcing them to do it. I think we have a mess here. And the country's going to have to learn critical thinking. That may be an impossible challenge for the US. But the fact that somebody told you something does not mean that it's true. I think that the greatest threat to democracy is misinformation because we're going to get really good at it. When I managed YouTube, the biggest problems we had on YouTube were that people would upload false videos and people would die as a result. And we had a no death policy. Shocking.
Yeah, and also, it's not even about potentially making deep fakes or misinformation. Just muddying the waters is enough to make the entire topic kind of untouchable.
I'm really curious about the text to action and its impact on, for example, computer science education. I'm wondering what you have thoughts on like how CS education should transform to kind of meet the age.
Well, I'm assuming that computer scientists as a group in undergraduate school will always have a programmer buddy with them. So when you learn your first for loop and so forth and so on, you'll have a tool that will be your natural partner. And that's how the teaching will go on. That the professor, he or she will talk about the concepts, but you'll engage with it that way. And that's my guess. Yes, ma'am, behind you.
So here I have a slightly different view. I think in the long run, there probably isn't going to be a need for programmers. Eventually, the LLMs will become so sophisticated that they will be writing their own kind of code. Maybe it gets to a point where we can't even read that code anymore. So there is a world in which it is not necessary to have programmers, researchers, or computer scientists. I'm not sure that's the way it's going to be, but there is a timeline in which that happens.
The most interesting country is India, because the top AI people come from India to the US. And we should let India keep some of its top talent, not all of them, but some of them. And they don't have the kind of training facilities and programs that we so richly have here. To me, India is the big swing state in that regard. China's lost. It's not going to come back. They're not going to change the regime as much as people wish them to do. Japan and Korea are clearly in our camp. Taiwan is a fantastic country whose software is terrible, so that's not going to work. Amazing hardware. And in the rest of the world, there are not a lot of other good choices that are big. Europe is screwed up because of Brussels. It's not a new fact. I spent 10 years fighting them. And I worked really hard to get them to fix the EU Act. And they still have all the restrictions that make it very difficult to do our kind of research in Europe. My French friends have spent all their time battling Brussels, and Macron, who's a personal friend, is fighting hard for this. And so France, I think, has a chance. I don't see Germany coming, and the rest is not big enough.
Given the capabilities that you envision these models having, should we still spend time learning to code?
Yeah.
So here she asked, should we still learn to code?
Because ultimately it's the old thing of why do you study English? If you can speak English, you get better at it, right? You really do need to understand how these systems work, and I feel very strongly. Yes, sir.
So these were the most important parts of the interview. With that being said, this is it for today's video. See you again next week with another video.